I think Outlast 2 is a pretty good game.
Where are we going?
Away from here. Anywhere but here.
Careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see.
Who will he have if he destroys us
There's a
all?
father up above, and he's looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see.
It was the first horror game I played since Five Nights at Freddy's 4 back in 2015. 6 years later, I thought I'd give horror another try, so I downloaded Outlast 2 and had the time of my life being scared by a Catholic priest, I think. It quickly became one of my favourite games, and so when I finished it, I naturally wanted to hear other people rave about it online. But strangely, when I searched for videos reviewing the game, people seemed kinda mixed about it, with a few not really liking the game. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of valid criticisms to make about the game. Having now played the first Outlast as well, I can see where people are coming from when they say that the second game's villains aren't as memorable as the first's. However, there is one particular moment I want to yap about today, because I've yet to hear anyone else express my specific interpretation of it, and because I feel that it ties into a wider point that the game is making. But one more thing before we begin. Content warning. Here's the one the game actually gives you when you press play, and please do pay attention to it. I'm going to be somewhat skirting around this particular one, but if you are sensitive to any of these on the screen, or if you are an actual child, please give this video a miss. Bye for now. Subscribe on the way out if you like. Also, I'm going to be spoiling basically everything about this game's story, especially the ending. Although I'm not sure knowing how the game ends will completely ruin the story for you. Do with that information as you will. And now, we can finally begin. Part 1. What is an Outlast 2? Outlast 2 centers on a Christian cult known as the Testament of the New Ezekiel. You play as Blake Langerman, cameraman for his journalist wife Lynn. When their helicopter crashes out in the Arizonan wilderness, members of the Testament kidnap Lynn, and it becomes your responsibility to find her again. Armed with nothing but this camera that has night vision and a mostly useless microphone, Blake is forced to run and hide from a bunch of followers of this cult for about 10 hours until the game finally ends. Along the way, you find out about their leader, Sullivan Noth, who claims to be a prophet from God, and who acts as the game's overarching antagonist. As well, you have to deal with Marta, Noth's childhood friend, who hunts you down with a pickaxe. Don't watch the death animations for being killed by Marta. Please don't. There are a couple of other antagonists that you deal with throughout the game, but very widely, that's how Outlast 2 functions. Pretty simple, right? Wrong sci-fi twist. Over the course of the game, Blake repeatedly sees these flashes of light coming from this distant tower. Now, there is a full explanation of what this is, connecting back to the first Outlast, but for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to waste your time laying it all out. Murkoff Corporation, microwaves, morphogenic engine, whatever. All we need to know is that this big tower makes Blake and everyone else nearby start hallucinating things. These hallucinations include, but are not limited to, a horrible nightmare creature in the Big Lake, Lynn being heavily pregnant with the Antichrist, and Catholic school? Okay, so these bits where you turn a corner and then bam, you're back in school, these are moments that reflect Blake's childhood trauma. Back in school, a girl he knew called Jessica was killed by a priest, with Blake as the only witness, but he was forced to say that it was a suicide. To this day, he has only repressed those memories, and all these bits set in the school are leading up to the revelation of what really happened. Meanwhile, outside of these school sections, the main plot finishes up with Blake rescuing a very pregnant Lynn during this huge storm. She gives birth to a child who is not real. Noth and his testament all die in a mass suicide, and Blake leaves after Lynn dies in her phantom childbirth. A bit of a wild way to end this game, but kind of insanely, I think it works, since we see resolutions to both the Lynn being in danger main plot, as well as the Blake's trauma subplot. So, I think this game is doing something that might already be clear to you. The writers are not saying that religion as a whole is bad, but rather, I think they're criticizing how people use positions of power in religious organizations for their own benefit, and harm others in doing so. Both major plots feed into this idea. As leader of the Testament, Noth is constantly shown abusing his followers. For example, you can find letters in the game that explicitly tell us that Noth has someone go in secret to the nearest town and pick up penicillin for him, while insisting all of his followers remain cut off from society, thus prohibiting their use of any medicine at all. As well, we do see him torture a guy, and we can learn about various other crimes of his that I'm not going to get into here.
Where did Val take her?
Similarly, in the school segments, the monster that Blake runs from is a representation of the priest from his school days. This figure of authority is transformed into a hideous creature that you must run and hide from, placing Blake in this position of impotence. On top of this, in the moment when you learn how the priest killed Jessica, you play as Blake from when he was a child. For only the second time in the game, you control a child version of Blake, forcing you to experience the same utter powerlessness as he did in that very moment. What this accomplishes is that sense of helplessness and vulnerability, the knowledge that this priest is abusing the power he has received as part of the Catholic Church while being fully unable to stop him. This once again demonstrates how someone may use authority in a religious group for their own selfish desires, which I think is the game's main point. That's what Outlast 2 is about. I think the game conveys these ideas quite effectively. In fact, after I finished it, Outlast 2 quickly became one of my favourite games, and one particular moment that I liked a lot, but that I haven't mentioned yet, is the death of Marta. Part 2. Marta's death is weird. So, remember Marta? Tall, pickaxe-wielding woman, childhood friend, and devout follower of Noth. Well, she's the first major antagonist who chases you around and tries to kill you. She dominates the first third of Outlast 2, acting as this omnipresent threat who just keeps popping up. Like, here she's dragging some guy's body, here she appears from nowhere, and here she bursts out of this fence. Just horror girl things, I guess. Now, one surprising thing to note is this. Marta isn't killed at the end of her section of the game, and neither does she die in the mass suicide at the end. When it comes to the other two major antagonists who chase Blake around, Laird and Val, well, the reason they stop chasing you around is because they die. However, the final time Blake escapes Marta, he just leaves her territory and promptly falls into this huge valley and a whole bunch of other stuff happens. But for some reason, Marta isn't killed. Why is that? Well, it's because she's going to make one final appearance at the end of the game. During the big storm, as Blake and Lynn are trying to make their escape, Marta reappears and corners them. It's over, right? Blake sort of pathetically falls over before she even gets close. Marta raises her pickaxe, and then the storm picks up this cross-shaped piece of metal and impales Marta. Blake and Lynn escape unharmed, and Lynn goes,
Fuck you! And fuck your god!
So, a deus ex machina is when some major problem is suddenly fixed by something beyond the protagonist's control or that hasn't previously been set up. And this moment, Marta being killed by the falling cross, this is textbook deus ex machina. The machine is the storm, and the god is God. There is one pretty obvious way to read this scene, that God is stepping in to save and protect Blake and Lynn at the end of the game. This is, to me, the most intuitive interpretation of this moment, and it's the interpretation discussed in Purposeless Rabbit Hole's video, Because It's Scary, an Outlast 2 analysis. I found this video when I was searching for other people who had enjoyed the game as much as I had. And although he doesn't come away with the same opinion of Outlast 2 as me, this is still a very entertaining video which I can highly recommend. He makes a lot of criticisms of the game, some of which I completely agree with, and others I completely disagree. But for the purposes of this video,
I'm going to focus specifically on his discussion of Marta's death. Rabbit Holes claims that this moment, along with the anticlimactic deaths of other villains in the game, is indicative of God protecting Blake, and that this choice by the writers weakens the game. He says that adding God into a deus ex machina doesn't make it any better. And this is a point that I've been thinking about for the 3 years that have passed since I first played the game and watched this video. Because, look, isn't there something kind of strange about Marta's death? As I said before, the writers purposefully chose not to kill Marta off when she stops being a threat in gameplay, unlike the game's other antagonists. And so, if this deus ex machina was some problem caused by the writers feeling that they had no way to resolve the plot in a satisfying way, then there's an obvious solution. Just have Marta die much earlier on. They had plenty of opportunities to do exactly this. That tells us something, doesn't it? I think that the contrived plot resolution isn't necessarily a problem for the story, but rather a purposeful choice by the writers, and this, in turn, only invites us to keep digging. So, I asked myself the following question. What if God, or at least this cross-shaped symbol of him, is not supposed to be protecting Blake, but rather punishing and condemning Marta?
Part 3. God was so popular that they added him to video games. One thing you'll notice if you Google the phrase Old Testament God is a bunch of articles posing the question, why is God so different between the Old and New Testaments of the Bible? You see, in the latter part of the Bible, the New Testament, Jesus arrives as the Son of God, and he's here to spread a message of love and forgiveness. Yes, he introduces the notion of hell, but the majority of what he preaches is about how God is willing to forgive any and everyone, so long as they believe in him. However, when we turn to the Old Testament, God is no longer presented this way. Prior to Jesus' arrival, he seems much more cruel and violent. He sends a worldwide flood to wipe out all humans except one family. He rains down burning sulfur on 2 cities. And he introduces the concept of death to the world when 2 people disobey him. And this is all in Genesis, the first book of 39 in the Old Testament. It isn't long after this that the Lord commands his people to use capital punishment in response to certain sins. This is a vastly different depiction of God than is found in the New Testament. Another moment I'd like to pick out from Genesis is when Jacob struggles with God. This man, Jacob, a descendant of Abraham, and thus one of the Lord's chosen people, is alone one night and encounters a mysterious man. Without a word passing between the two of them, they start wrestling, and it's sort of unclear why. The mystery man painfully injures Jacob's hip, and only later does Jacob realize that the man was actually God all along. Extremely strange and interesting story, in my opinion, but the reason I bring this up is because of how Jacob experiences his relationship to the Lord. As I said, they don't speak at all. Rather, the only way they interact is through struggle and then pain in Jacob's injury. The people of Noth's testament, in the same way, worship a god they know to be cruel. The followers are constantly aware of the Skald, the group of people in the testament who are seemingly struck down with an unending plague. The figures of authority in the cult, such as Noth and Marta, are violent, hurting and killing people who turn away from their god. All of these followers are also forced to murder their newborn children, according to Noth's prophecy that he claims to have received from God. Their conception of God cannot possibly be misconstrued as merciful or loving, and everyone there must know it. As well, take the example of Laird, the game's second antagonist. He has a brief moment of doubt in his faith.
Where is your gospel? You're supposed to have a gospel for us.
But as soon as he quells this doubt and becomes certain of God again, look how he reacts.
This is our gospel. How could I not have known? Lord, please forgive me for doubting you. There is no suffering that I do not deserve. I am a worm, festering wound.
He doesn't expect God's forgiveness to be freely granted to him for an honest mistake. Rather, he knows that this mercy will only be bestowed upon him after extensive punishment. At the end of the game, with all the Testament dead except their leader, Noth tells Blake that God has stopped speaking to him. And in this moment, Noth's only concern is wondering how God will enact his cruelty and punishment now, without a chosen people to cause pain.
Who will he have if he destroys us all? Who will he have left to punish?
He says it as if he's genuinely worried about the Lord's well-being, as if to him God could not possibly go on existing without a dedicated group of people to cause harm. Just like Jacob wrestling with the mysterious man, Noth and his followers experience God primarily through the suffering he inflicts on them, and hence it would make sense for Marta to be struck down in a way most befitting the God of the Old Testament. He who introduced capital punishment appears to exact that same punishment on Marta. And this cruel depiction of God suggests, in my opinion, that we should read Marta's death as a punishment enacted against her, rather than an act of mercy delivered to Blake. By shifting our idea of God, we can see this moment not just as the protagonist being suddenly saved from danger, but more importantly, as a condemnation of an antagonist. This has an interesting implication that I'm going to explore soon. But first, let's look at some more evidence for this. Take the game's biblical references, for example. From what I can tell, the majority are connected to the Old Testament. The cult believe Sullivan Noth to be a prophet, something far more common before the time of Jesus, and he even names himself the modern Ezekiel, after an Old Testament prophet. As well, Outlast 2 is split into 6 chapters, 5 of which take their names from Old Testament books. Even the chapter in which Blake is literally crucified avoids an easy reference to Jesus, instead taking the name Job after the first poetry book of the Old Testament. If the writers had made a reference to Jesus, this could have suggested some hope for the future, but by referring to Job instead, who suffered for very little reason, they place a stronger emphasis on the suffering of Noth's followers and Blake in this chapter. This all points quite nicely to our God of punishment. But what about the times the game does refer to the New Testament? Well, the biggest potential problem for our idea is the game's final chapter being named Revelation, after the last book in the Bible, and this is the chapter in which we see Marta killed. Naturally, this name makes sense for a chapter in which you find out what happened to Blake in the school, as well as seeing the end of Noth's group. However, I'm not convinced this surface-level reference is as far as it goes. Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 and 19, 2 of the final 4 verses of the Bible, are a warning. In the context of Revelation, a prophecy about the end times of the world, they are a warning that God will punish anyone who adds to or removes from this prophecy. The Lord will add plagues to such a person or remove from them their eternity in heaven. But, in a wider context, with this warning placed at the tail end of the Holy Book, they serve also as a warning not to make any alterations to the Bible as a whole. To Christians, this book is complete and needs no additions or subtractions. Despite this, as you explore the homes of Noth's followers in Outlast 2, you might find fragments of a new biblical book, a book telling of the prophecy that Noth has brought them. Noth, who deems the Bible incomplete, needs to add his own visions about the Antichrist and the end times. And so, we see God's promise come true as he strikes Marta down and abandons Noth, all in this apocalyptic storm. When referencing the New Testament, the writers selected the moment in which God displays the most potential for punishment, thus further emphasizing the violent nature of God's depiction in this game. Part 4. This is cool, but why though? You've gotten this far into the video,
heard me be pedantic for 15 minutes or so about whether God is punishing Marta or protecting Blake in a moment where he's basically doing both, and you may be thinking, why does any of this matter? Well, I think this Deus Ex Machina moment is important to the game's central ideas. As this moment is a representation of God condemning and punishing Marta, and by extension Sullivan Noth, then it is in turn a condemnation of their practices, their beliefs about the Lord, and the way they have treated their followers. It is the very God they have dedicated their lives to, turning back to them and telling them they did it all wrong. Alongside Noth and Marta, we also see the harm caused to Blake and his friend Jessica by the priest at their school. The writers show us these three figures of authority, all of whom have power granted to them by their religious organizations, and all of whom use their power to harm other members below them in the hierarchy. And this is why it's so powerful for the writers to depict God brutally rejecting Noth and Marta. If their God disagrees with their actions, then their abuse of power is condemned with them, disregarded by the game's narrative, and altogether rejected, along with their flawed perception of God. This is truly hammered home by Lynn's reaction to Marta's death.
Fuck you! And fuck your god!
Therefore, this Deus Ex Machina is placed here to condemn those who misuse power granted to them by religious organizations. I think this is why Noth gets barely any screen time. He only makes 2 appearances across the entire game, and it seems to me like that's the writer's way of saying that he's just yapping. All these cruel and awful things he preaches, they're not worth our time. And we can take this idea even further. Argue that the writers are saying that all power structures in religious organizations are harmful, used only as tools of the power-hungry to trample on innocent people who look up to them and believe in the same God as them. To me, this seems to be the conclusion that the writers want us to draw from the game. Additionally, a consequence of the explicit condemnation of these figures of authority is that the writers are, I feel, not condemning religion as a whole. Yes, we have only seen negative depictions of religion in this game, but Outlast 2 in no way suggests that all of Noth's followers are evil. Sure, many of them chase you and hunt you down, but these random guys aren't given fleshed out motivations or ideas. They're only doing this because they want to serve Noth, the powerful figure who has led them to a dangerous and skewed version of Christianity. And some followers even hide inside their houses, only attacking you if you come inside, seemingly in self-defense. These people aren't evil, they've just been convinced by a bad person to believe something harmful. Religion isn't necessarily bad. Only the ones who abuse it in selfish or dangerous ways are in the wrong. So, yes, actually, I do think writing God into your Deus Ex Machina can make it better. It can even convey some important ideas central to your story. And that's why I like this moment so much. Having God seemingly strike down Marta is, to me, a powerful way to discredit the evil and cruel ways in which the leaders of the Testament use their power. I think that's pretty strong storytelling. Okay, that's it for the video. If you like these cute little drawings of me, go and check out my partner's Instagram page, @bowberry.nerd, with a 3 instead of the E in nerd. You'll probably like the rest of their art, and you'll definitely like it if you also like Genshin Impact for some reason. And on your way out of here, you can like and subscribe if you want to. But please, whatever you do, remember, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Matthew chapter 7, verse 15.